A very warm welcome to you. Zimbabwe's overall human rights record remains poor despite a recent rare commendation by Amnesty International. In its latest annual report, the human rights watchdog praised the Zimbabwean government for enacting the Children's Amendment Act of 2023, which criminalizes marriages of people under the age of 18. However, the same report harshly criticized Zimbabwe in other aspects of human rights violations. The report further warned that the rapid advancement of artificial intelligence worldwide and the disinformation that AI helps spread could lead to further breakdowns in the international rule of law. Zimbabwean courts continue to be used by authorities as a tool for repression.
Pattern where the magistrate court convicted, political activists, despite the fact that their lawyers would have highlighted the gaps or the weaknesses in those cases, but they were convicted after either going through pre-trial detention, and a few months down the line, those convictions would then be overturned by the High Court. So in this case, we see a pattern of the use of the justice system to persecute political activists. We further recorded a case that related to legal practitioners being arrested. In this particular case, we noted the case of Doug Coltart and Tapiwa Mchineripi, who are both members of the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, who were arrested for advising the police that their clients, Ombera Ishenende and Sonele Mkushani, were in poor health and under medical review following their abduction and torture by alleged state security agents. The lawyers were charged with obstruction of justice. They were initially detained, then released on bail, but again this year the charges were withdrawn. Apart from repressive pieces of legislation, we also noted that the right to protest was restricted. We noted that there were arrests of individuals or groups who protested. In this regard, we have the arrest of the 6 University of Zimbabwe students as an example. These students were protesting against the prolonged incarceration of political activists such as Charles Sinkala and Jacob Ngarivume. They were arrested, detained, denied bail for a number of weeks, then subsequently released on bail. But as we speak, you may recall that this year, the charges that were being leveled against the students were ultimately withdrawn. But they had spent time in pre-trial detention in 2023. We, however, also took note of some positive developments as they relate to human rights in the country in 2023. And one of such a development is the enactment or the amendment to the Children's Amendment Act number 8 of 2023. Positive provisions in this piece of legislation include the removal of all clauses that refer to anyone under the age of 18 as a young person, defining them instead as children in line with the Constitution.
To unpack this a bit more further for us, we're now joined by Dr. Charles Sinkala, International Relations Consultant, and he joins us now via our telephone line. Charles, thank you so much for your time this evening here in SABC News. I mean, just listening there to that insert and that clip, one would ask, what do you make of the Amnesty International report, which commends Zimbabwe, but at the same time also criticizes them for their wrongs?
Thank you very much for having me, and good evening to your listeners. It is important to point out that any discussion of human rights in Zimbabwe as it relates to either politics and governance must be taken into account into 2 issues. One is that of the upholding the rule of law, and the other one is the international context in which Zimbabwe is located. It's safe to say in this regard that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights expresses the moral thinking of international law and sets the standard for judging governments that act outside the ethical framework it has been established. You know, the report by the Amnesty International, yes, it is their view that they have viewed in terms of the human violations by Zimbabwe, which historically comes a very long way in terms of building up post the colonial rule. And what has happened in terms of Zimbabwe being accused of allegedly abusing the authority. But like I've mentioned, you know, one will be the side of the upholding the rule of law, and the other influence from the international community.
And looking at this report and looking at the situation on the ground in Zimbabwe, can one say that this is a true reflection of the state of human rights in Zimbabwe?
The report cannot completely reflect the human rights status in Zimbabwe unless one travels there and interrogates the Zimbabwean government, interrogates the policymakers, interrogates the members of parliament who enacts these laws into government. You must remember that government alone consists of the lawmakers who, part of them, they are part of the opposition, and as well they are influenced by the human rights activists who are present there in Zimbabwe. So it is not true, you know, to the state that completely Zimbabwean government has intended on an agenda to violate the human rights.
And one can also ask, when it comes to a country that has just seen elections in Zimbabwe in August last year, and seeing what some of the opposition leaders were put through during their campaign trail, and look at some of the commendments being made by Amnesty International. What do you make of that, especially when so many political leaders were condemning the government for their acts?
It is important to understand as well that during an election, it's a period where there is a competition between political rivals and the political opposition organization that would like to take on government, and as well as government would like to survive, to stay in power, to pursue their agenda. It is not safe to judge a country during that time because of what will be going on. For instance, what is going on in South Africa at this stage, the court cases between the IEC and as well the MK, who maybe other parts of society within South Africa view them as another just party which will become and destabilize the country. So it is very difficult in terms of establishing any facts thereof. But yes, Zimbabwe has been accused as a police state for many years due to the hardships. But we also must consider other external factors. Especially the land redistribution, which occurred during the 1999 to 2000 year 2000. Where a lot of minority white farmers were displaced, and I think that has also contributed in terms of either sanctions, or there has been an agenda, to make sure that the Zimbabwean government works with the former colonial masters in terms of the economic activities. You must remember that these territories are not owned by whoever who has claimed the independence in Africa. These territories are still economically owned by the actual colonial masters and powers.
And taking a look and zooming into the courts in Zimbabwe, what would you say has been the role of the courts in Zimbabwe in terms of protecting the rights of Zimbabweans?
Well, the courts, as as we have likely seen, that they prescribe to the independence of the judiciary, just like any other developing nation in the world. But we can see that the Constitution of Zimbabwe, Chapter 4, is endowed with the Bill of Rights, which stipulates the respect to the human rights, and as well as the respect of international treaties such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations and other treaties that Zimbabwe is part of. And I think the implementation of those rights as well has limitations in the sense that each and every human right is got a limitation. Where one's rights ends, it's where another person's rights begins. So if those political opponents or any other individual within the Zimbabwean circumstances would like to exercise their human rights beyond the boundaries of the law, the courts as the justice system are charged, to make sure that there's no violations in terms of the abuse of those rights.
And as much as we've seen the commendments from the International or Amnesty International report, rather, one would also ask, as much as we've seen criticism for the Zimbabwean government, one would also ask, what is Zimbabwe getting right in terms of human rights in that country?
Well, as we've seen from the report, of course, some other areas, they cannot be all glory, but other areas as well has been commended by the Amnesty International. But would like as well to expose in a more neutral sense, to involve other organizations such as the AU, the regional bloc like the SABC, especially following the very damning report post the elections of August 2023 last year, where I think it had brought in as well a diplomatic fight, rather, between Zambia and Zimbabwe in terms of the violation of human rights and the way they actually contend those elections. But it is safe to say that Zimbabwe is not, free from any influence in terms of their governance, and I'm sure they are trying their level best in terms of developing and implementing these human rights, especially where now we have a lot of civil society and human rights organizations who are watching whatever the government that is doing. I think, was it early this year or last year, where we saw that they had to suspend, the laws that governs the execution of those who are convicted for serious crimes. And I think there's a sense of them improving, if at all they are actually moving forward.
Dr. Sinkala, thank you so much for your time this evening here in SABC News. That is Dr. Charles Sinkala. He is an international relations consultant.